And joining us now is Ontario's new NDP leader, Andrea Horwath. Welcome to TVO.
Thank you, Steve.
Good to have you. I'm going to ask you the weirdest first question I suspect you've ever been asked, but I ask it because on Convention Day a month ago, I heard your name mispronounced so many different times that why don't we just get it right? You spell it Horwath, but
Yes.
you pronounce it Horwath.
Horwath.
How come?
Yes. That's because that's the way I was taught to pronounce it. My dad was Czechoslovakian, and we pronounced the W as a V.
Horwath it is.
Horwath it is.
Tell me about that day. What's your strongest memory of winning?
The strongest memory was actually the first ballot. I didn't expect to be as far ahead on the first ballot as I was, and it was a thrill. And I knew when that first ballot came in that it was likely going to end up the way it did. So it was absolutely thrilling, to be honest with you.
And let's bring the numbers up just to remind everybody how it is that you're sitting in that chair today. You won on the third ballot with more than 60% of the votes. Peter Tabbins was second, almost 40% of the votes. Gilles Bisson and Michael Proulx, two of your other caucus colleagues, were eliminated on previous ballots. You probably knew after the first ballot you were going to win, right?
We expected it, but you never know. I mean, even when you added up the votes that didn't come my way on the first ballot, it couldn't quite get over my numbers, and so we were expecting that it was going to go my way. But you never know. I mean, people change their position second and third ballot, and we were pretty happy. I was pretty happy.
It was in Hamilton, the convention, your hometown.
Yes, it was.
Did that make a difference?
I believe it does in terms of the momentum and the way I felt about it, certainly. But it was a one-member, one-vote system, and so members across the province were able to vote both in advance and on day of convention. So I think for the momentum and for the feel of it, it was very positive for me. But really, with the one-member, one-vote, it was people all across the province were voting.
It's not exactly one-member, one-vote, as you know, because 25% of the votes of the convention are reserved for organized labor. And I do want to ask you about that because there is an argument which... Well, two arguments. Labor has a special place in your party, therefore they're entitled to that special representation. Or, because Labor's got that special position in your party, you can't broaden your base to where it needs to go. Which is more accurate?
I think the former is more accurate, and I say that because, and it's interesting, when you look at the numbers as they came out after the thing was all said and done, I was pleased to get both the majority of Labor votes, but also if you look at the raw membership votes, I also won on the membership alone as well. And so for me that's an important thing because a lot of people characterized it as, well, Labor won me the election because I had a lot of Labor support. But in fact, if you took away the Labor votes, I still would have come out ahead, and I think that's an important piece. And I do think it's the former because I believe that although people in some ways see a divide in workers, if you will, unionized versus non-unionized, white collar versus blue collar, sometimes public versus private sector workers, I think at the end of the day, the struggles that Labor fights for and that Labor is active on are ones that resonate across communities and across the province, and so. Okay,
but having said that, you must know there's a chunk of people in this province, lower middle class, upper middle class, certainly upper class, for whom this special relationship that your party has with Labor is a real obstacle to their potentially supporting you. What do you say to them about this?
I think that the best way to have that conversation is to talk about where the struggles are common. And so I think about things like a decent healthcare system. I think about things like a decent education system. I think about people's basic rights at work, rights to health and safety, rights to pensions, those kinds of issues. And I know that there's this sense that Labor has achieved some of these things for its members, particularly when I think about pensions, really, and decent wages and benefits. But the idea isn't that we want only organized labor to have these benefits, but we want to see people all across the spectrum have rights at work, have decent wages, be able to go to work and work for 40 hours a week and actually be able to earn enough money to make a decent wage and not make a decent quality of life and not be still living under the poverty line. And so I think that Labor has been fighting that fight not just for the workers that are unionized, that have signed a card and are bargaining collectively with their union, but for all workers. You've seen the Labor movement, if you want to call it that in terms of its umbrella organization, the Ontario Federation of Labour or the Canadian Labour Congress, take on fights, for example, for the foreign nannies, for the foreign caregivers issue, around temp agencies and the exploitation of workers that are
I'm not arguing any of that stuff with you. I'm not arguing that. But I suspect there are people right now who are watching who will say, you know what, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but I'll take the analogy one step further. Mike Harris won power twice in a row, in part because he convinced the average person, Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario, that he represented their interests. And the question for you is, can you do that if you're so clearly aligned with the interests of organized labor?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people in retrospect will see that those interests weren't really being represented by the conservative government of the day.
Only won 2 in a row.
They did, but we've also seen a decimated healthcare system, a decimated education system. We've seen increasing child poverty and poverty overall in this province. And now, 10 years later or 15 years later, people are realizing that a big part of what's happened to some of the things that we were proud of as a province, and some of the things that, in fact, people kicked out the Harris government as a result of, we're seeing that was not a good experiment, that divide and conquer attitude, that negative wedge type of politics that Harris brought in.
You'd love his coalition, though. You'd love his 45% of the electorate that supported him in '95 and in '99. You would.
Well, I would love it. Yes, I would.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be honest about that. Absolutely, I would. But I think that now people are looking at some of the results of those decisions and where we are now, and the fact that we haven't had overall improvement in the quality of life for people in this province, and we're trying to rebuild that. And you see that even in newspapers that used to perhaps support the Harris way of doing things. We see now people are looking back and saying, we should have had a safety net that kept people, out of dire poverty. We should have been able to provide opportunity for young people. We should have been able to make sure that seniors are not living with indignity and soiled diapers for hours and hours on end in long-term care facilities. So it's not good to pull the resources out of these systems. We need to keep them strong because we need to give people dignity and quality of life.
Okay, let me ask you a bit about your background and your philosophy, this kind of thing. This seems like a very simple question, but I do recall one former NDP leader getting tripped up on this at one time or another. Are you a socialist?
Oh, I said this to the Toronto Star actually during the campaign. Yes, I believe I am. I believe I am. And it's interesting. I had a conversation a couple of years ago in Hamilton before I was an MPP. I was a city councillor at the time. And one of the prominent developers of our community, I was at an Italian club and we were having lunch and talking to a number of different folks at the time. And his son was there. So it's a family kind of luncheon, if you will. And his son was maybe about 8 or 9 years old, and this fellow, who's a conservative, said to me, said to his son, pointed at me and said to his son, that woman thinks that Daddy makes too much money, and she wants me to make less money. And I said to his son, I said, that's a little bit true. I said, I think your daddy makes a lot of money. You have a nice house, right? And the young fellow said, yes. And I said, well, I think your daddy can make just a little less money so that the kids in your school that are really poor and have no money would have a little bit more. I said, do you believe in that? And he says, I think you're right. So that's how I describe it. I mean, for me, it's about each according to their need, based on each according to their means, right?
Your predecessor that I referred to was, of course, Bob Rae.
I knew who that was.
Who may have had trouble with it because he was really not a socialist.
Absolutely.
And of course, he's in the Liberal Party now. Here's a quote from you on Convention Day. The middle class is disappearing, you said, and the working class is largely unemployed. We could accept this and adjust. That's what the other parties say. But adjust to what? Growing unemployment lines and growing food bank lines? Adjust to this growing discrepancy? Adjust so that those who stole our money can get more of it? We refuse to adjust. Mm-hmm. That's...
Them's fighting words.
Well, I don't have to tell you. A lot of people have pointed to that, and I do want to unpack that a little bit because there's a lot of themes there that I think we need to look into. It's tough language, it's strong language, it's, some might say, rather ideological and rigid. And again, does this kind of language hurt you in your efforts to achieve what you have said you want to achieve, which is a broader base and double the membership of the NDP?
I don't think so, particularly not in the economic context that we find ourselves in right now. I mean, we've just seen more layoffs at GM in Oshawa. We've seen CAW workers now concerned about loss of their pensions. I think that the description of what's happening out there is reflected in much of those words. And I think what my point was at the end, and that's the phrase that particularly people are concerned about, that we will not adjust. I believe that we have opportunity with the economic downturn that we've seen to make decisions as we try to rebuild the economy. And those decisions, I'm hoping, will be ones that will begin to see some more equity in our society. And I think that's where I'm going with those kinds of words. It's about looking at where we've been, looking at what's happened in terms of the world economy, and saying, do we want to continue on that same path? Do we want to have the same kind of inequity and the same kind of society, more or less, that we have just come from? Or are we going to use this as an opportunity to build a future that's more equitable for more people?
Because I want to make sure I'm really clear on what you meant by that, because of course, as you know, the cliche goes, change is the only constant in life. And I wonder whether you are giving people a kind of a false hope that they can go back to the way it was, we don't have to adjust, by saying things like that, when of course we can't go back, we're not going to go back, it's not on.
No, but I think it's. I think what I don't want to see us adjusting to is a low-wage economy where people cannot eke out a decent standard of living, and I don't. I think that we can make decisions that, for example, enable us to build the products of the future here in Ontario, with workers here in Ontario, with the industrial base that we have here in Ontario. Maybe not making the same products, so maybe our industrial infrastructure won't be used for the same kinds of manufacturing.
So people will have to adjust.
But yes, but I guess the point is not adjust to a low-wage economy that doesn't provide good-paying manufacturing jobs, and that's what I don't see happening in Ontario. I don't see the provincial government committed to making sure that our manufacturing base is maintained and is strong and is revitalized to make those products of the future, whether they're windmills, windmill components, windmill generators, whether they're solar panels, whether they're electric cars. I don't see that kind of vision right now in Ontario. You see it in Quebec. In Quebec, they have a 60% buy Quebec policy for green energy projects, and so now they have the largest manufacturing of wind turbines in Quebec across the entire country, because they've been focusing on making sure that they're going to bring those jobs to Quebec and put workers in the manufacturing sector to work there. That's what I mean. I don't think it's good enough for governments to say, well, manufacturing is dead, we're going to give up on manufacturing, it's no longer going to be part of our future, because it is the fundamental place where decent wages are earned and where people are able to get a good quality of life.
How much of that philosophy of yours comes from who your dad was?
Probably a lot of it, to be honest. I mean, my dad was my dad was an auto worker. My dad was an immigrant. He was an immigrant from Czechoslovakia. He arrived when he was about 16 years old. Went into industrial work almost immediately. Did some farming first, I believe. But yeah, spent his entire working career more or less at Ford in Oakville in the truck plant. And I was raised in a unionized household. My dad was active in his union. He was never elected to office, but he went to all his union meetings, and I read all his bulletins that came into the household, and we had political conversations about workers and about unions, and went to the union picnic every year, and yeah, it was, I'm sure it shaped a lot of where I come from.
And you got to go to university, I
Absolutely.
guess, because he made a decent wage as a unionized employee.
There's no doubt about it. And in fact, it's one of my fondest memories is when I was in high school, and my father used to say to me, honey, take typing. And I used to say, Dad, I'm not taking typing. I'm going to take science, and I'm going to take math, and I'm going to take all these other important courses. Finally, by grade 11, I thought, okay, he's probably right, I should take typing. And I'm really glad I did, because in the computer age, that keyboarding is really important.
But that experience of a guy who could sort of go to the plant every day and make a good wage, and
and have good benefits, and we always had dental. I mean,
right,
I have good teeth.
And give his family a vacation every year. That whole thing.
Yep.
Is that what's the word? Can people really expect that in this part of the 21st century?
I would hope that we can, and I say that because I believe that it's about how do we distribute the wealth that society creates, and again, one of the criticisms from that speech was the idea of those who stole our money, and again, it's about who is benefiting from the wealth that society creates, and I'm not saying that there is no room for, in a capitalist society, we know that the markets rule, and we know that there is a role for the shareholders, and all of these kinds of pieces have to be a part of the society that we're in. I understand that. But at the same time, I don't think that it's appropriate to expect people to be able to be part of the generation of the wealth and not the sharing of it.
But that lifestyle that you've just described, or that experience, that life experience, is disappearing.
It is.
Auto workers can no longer expect to make, and we can argue about what the figures were after benefits were included, $50, $60, $70 an hour. That's not on anymore. Certainly not at the Detroit 3, and even at the Hyundai and Honda and Toyota and all these other places as well. So again, it gets back to that word. Do you have to adjust? At the end of the day, do you have to adjust?
Well, I guess it's a matter of trying to determine whether. So when you look at so I have a brother actually. My father was a Ford worker. My brother works at Toyota. And we've had this conversation as well. And he gets angry when people say auto workers make too much money. Because in his company, of course, the executives, every level of management has a wage that's much more proportionate to those of the guys on the shop floor, the women on the shop floor. And he turns to that and says, the big three are in trouble, and everybody's saying that auto workers make too much money. He said, in my company, we make good money. He said, but our managers don't make 25, 35 times what the people on the shop floor make. And so again, it's about the proportion of wealth that's going to the various players within the system. And so I don't think we should always be saying that it's the worker that has to take the hit, or it's the woman or man on the shop floor that's the one that has to scale back. I mean, one of the things that we're calling for with aid to the auto industry is caps on executive salaries to a maximum of $400,000 annually.
Let me ask you a little more about your political philosophy. One of your competitors for the leadership, and certainly plenty of people in the center-left movement over the years, have been looking for this kind of Tony Blair third way of doing business. You're not one of them, are you?
No, I'm not one of them.
How come?
I'm not one of them. I just I don't believe that that's the way to go. I believe there's already a heck of a lot of attention to the kinds of movement towards the center right, if you will, from the other political parties. I don't believe that that way has gotten us very far, quite frankly. In terms of the values that I talked about, in terms of the values around equity and around quality of life and around having a society that provides for the people that live in it, and whether that's providing for healthcare or education or you know, aging and dignity, any of those kinds of things. And so I don't believe that that's the way to go. I've not bought into that third way, and that's not where I am.
There's more people there, though, right? There are more potential votes in the third way than there are, I don't want to say marginalized, but further over in the traditional left, don't you think?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's the case. I'm really not sure. I would expect that that there are some who see things that way, but I don't believe that that's certainly not the way I'm prepared to go.
One of the things that really struck me as curious on the day that you won your leadership was that in your first scrum with reporters, after you'd won, you answered about 10 or 15 minutes worth of questions before, I think it was me actually, who said, has anybody asked her here yet whether she's proud to be the first woman leader of the NDP? Mm-hmm. So I don't know whether to ask that question, which seems awfully conventional old-fashioned now, or ask the question, do you find it interesting that that doesn't seem to be news anymore? There's a major party in this province led by a woman. Yeah.
Well, you know what? I think that's a good sign, actually. If it's not news, perhaps it's a good sign. Perhaps it's a sign that says that women can and should be achieving any level of career height as any man could, and I think that's a positive thing. Having said that, there have been a few articles written in the newspapers around the extent to which having a woman leader, particularly asking the Premier questions, does that change the tone in the legislature? Does that change the way that the Premier responds? Does that put him off guard? And some of these
what's your view on
speculations? Well, you know, it's been interesting. I've noticed that it's not been consistent in terms of when I ask questions, how the Premier responds. So there's been, and how some of the other ministers respond as well. So there's no doubt that there's been an attempt to change up the way that the government's responding to me. I don't know whether they're doing polling to find out how it's resonating out there or not, but it is interesting because they seem to they're trying to find a way of approach that's not going to cause them problems.
I don't have to tell you that many people thought your predecessor, Howard Hampton, while they respected him on many fronts, found him to be loud and sanctimonious during question period. Do you plan to be loud and sanctimonious during question period?
I don't think I have been so far. I'm trying to be. I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting process to get up every day and hammer the government in terms of criticism. So I'm trying to find a way of bringing forward the issues that's serious, that at times are passionate, but I'm trying to find my feet, and I'm hoping I'm doing an all right job with that.
A couple of more things. Is it important for you to win power?
I believe that it's important for any political party that has a vision and that believes that their vision is the one that will lead to a better way of life in the province to achieve power, absolutely, because my 5 years now as a person in opposition, it's very clear that you can try to convince the government that your way of doing things is the right way to do. You can try to bring amendments to legislation, for example, or try to push the government through pressure to look at options that you're bringing to the table. But ultimately, the kinds of solutions that you want to see implemented will never be implemented unless you are the governing party.
But in order to govern, you may have to make compromises that you don't want to make. Are you prepared to make those compromises?
Yes, in fact, it's interesting. I've actually been in a situation at the municipal level where you know, there's no party politics at the Hamilton City Council. well, none overtly anyways. And so that's an exercise in compromise, and it's an exercise in working with people to come up with solutions that the broadest amount of participants feel that they can support. And that way you know that when you implement, you get the support, and you can move forward without a lot of resistance. And so I'm accustomed to doing that kind of work. Again, it would be, I think it would be, I mean, it's not easy to say with one broad, brush, oh, I would compromise on everything. But there is, I think I have the experience to realize that as you're implementing change, as you're implementing policy, you have to be very, very careful and make sure that you're doing that in a wise way and in a way that's not going to create destabilization, because you don't want that either.
But with the exception of Bob Rae's years, 1990 to 95, when the NDP were in power, the NDP has, I think, always been satisfied to be the so-called conscience of the legislature. Will you be satisfied with that role as well?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I look to other provinces like Saskatchewan, other provinces like Manitoba, other provinces that have, even Quebec has got some very progressive policies. I mean, when you look for example, to Quebec in their childcare policy, you can see that there is opportunity within Canada to have universal childcare that's affordable and accessible to parents. These are some of the things that I think we need to be doing in Ontario, and we can look to other governments. For example, in Saskatchewan, I mean, they didn't have it within the same economic context that we're all living in right now. They brought down a budget just before our budget came down in Ontario that did not have a deficit. And so there are, and it's an NDP government, and so there are ways that we can see these things occur. We can see governments that are progressive, that are left, if you want to say, that are New Democrat, that bring good policy to the table.
I just want to make sure I understood you. You're saying this is Saskatchewan government today?
Manitoba, sorry.
Manitoba, okay,
sorry,
yes, Manitoba.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're conservative in Saskatchewan.
Yes, they are.
Last question. You liking the job?
I am. I am liking the job. I'm finding it very challenging, but very stimulating, and I'm having a great deal of positive response. I mean, one of the things that I had said I wanted to do was to continue the momentum and to re-engage the members of the party, because, as you mentioned, this idea of trying to double the membership of the party by the time the next election comes is not something that one person does alone. It's something that's going to necessitate a heck of a lot of groundwork from people all over the province. And I'm getting such a great response from riding associations and from activists and from people who say, I met a woman in the legislature just the other day, and she said, I used to be active in the party, and I'm just not anymore. I never get any mailings, and I don't know what's going on. I want you to get me back on the list. And that was a good sign to me. It says people are starting to once again think that being members of our party is going to be a positive step and something that will grow us, and that's important.
Andrea Horwath, congratulations again on your win, and thanks for visiting us at TVO tonight.
My pleasure as always, Steve. Thank you.